Um, David Haskiya, do I pronounce it right?
Haskiya.
Haskiya, okay, yes, from the Swedish National Heritage Board. Challenges and opportunities for Swedish museums in digitizing their collections.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm David Haskiya, as Giorgio said. I work at the Swedish National Heritage Board, and I'll explain a little bit more about what I do there. I used to work at Europeana before, so the data I work with has actually become smaller, which is why you'll see in my presentation that I put parentheses around the word big, because I don't actually know whether we have big data really in Sweden, at least the volume aspect for it. So I'll introduce myself, a little bit of what my team is doing, and then I will proceed with what's here on this little table of contents. A little bit of a note here, I will focus almost exclusively on collections data, collections metadata. I may mention user research related data in passing, but not really visitor data and that type of analytics. So I think it was Susan, when she was presenting at the National Library, she mentioned that how our National Library is created. Well, kings create them, or presidents in some cases. In our case, the National Heritage Board of Sweden, it actually was a king. And this also allows me to introduce that one thing that my team does is that we have an aggregator of museum collections. So we have a collection of collections, a little bit more than 60 Swedish museums whose digital collections have been put into one big collection that the National Heritage Board takes care of, and we distribute its contents via APIs and user interfaces. This is a screenshot from the user interface of that aggregator, and this is an agent entity representing this king and how he is, that display looks like here. And my team then specifically, we do work with this aggregator, as I mentioned. It's called Swedish Open Cultural Heritage. It also is a national aggregator for Europeana. Beyond that, we also work with developing what I would call best or at least good digital practice in support of Swedish museums. Our team doesn't really work very much internally in the National Heritage Board. We have been set up explicitly to support museums around the country. Museums, many of which are the size where they can't be expected to have their own sort of digital R&D team of their own. So in many cases, we just sort of spread on the good word. There's no need for my team to develop AAAF. It's already there, but we can spread the word. And in some cases, we take existing design ideas or technology ideas and do some prototyping or evaluations of them. And when we do that, we always work together with volunteer partners from the museum community. That's sort of part of spreading the best practices, is that we never do a best practice project without having partners from the museums. We also, at least for the next couple of years, are running an incubator for small businesses and entrepreneurs who want to create digital services or products aimed at the museum market. There's a couple of other of these museum incubators around the world. I think we're, at least as far as I know, we're the fourth one that I can think of. I think the first one is probably one in New Zealand called Mahuki. That includes also a co-working space, and we run these kind of hackathons as well. But it's a very new thing, and my team is completely new as well from the National Heritage Board's perspective. So we haven't been up and running for a long while. When Mahendra was presenting on the first day, he talked about a library labs, and this is the big museum data conference, and that made me think whether is there actually a difference between a library lab and a museum lab. And one difference I can think of, at least in our case, is that part of our offering is not only are we a digital lab sort of in the service of Swedish museums, we also have an entire workshop for creating everything that goes into a physical exhibition. So we can do both hardware and digital and in combination. So not only hackers, but also makers, if you can use that term. So this leads me a little bit, that was the introduction, so a bit back on track then, on what I was going to present today. So Is big data a challenge for Swedish museums today? I would say yes, because data in general is a challenge for Swedish museums today. Not in the sense that they don't have any data, but in the sense that they don't make as much of it as they could. Most Swedish museums produce quite a lot of collections data, but they are entirely dependent in terms of technology on commercial software vendors, and besides using the collections data to make their own internal processes more efficient when it comes to managing the collection behind the scenes, they tend to do a very basic online publication, and that's it. And some of the smaller museums haven't gotten there yet. So when my team speaks with our customers, the Swedish museums, those who have already come a bit on the way on their digitization journey, on their digital transformation, they want to find ways to exploit their data and other types of content integrated into exhibitions or in teaching or in other ways, really sort of make something out of it. Whereas the small museums, often run only by volunteers, for example, they really come and ask the question, how do we publish our collection online in the first place? So the variety of needs in my audience, the museums, is very, very big. So if I do my own little definition of what big data is, if big data could mean that you need specialist skills and tools to really make sense of it and actually put it to good use, then yes, Swedish museums have a big data problem, but they do not have petabytes of data. And I think the major challenge here in making something of the data is not really lack of money. I think the museums, if you had invited them, they might have said we need more money. I do think more my own analysis would say that it's a lack of specialist skills. There's 2,500 museums in Sweden. Most of them is a long tail of very small local museums. We have about 25 state-funded, centrally funded museums. Of those, I'm only aware of 2 that has something that could be likened to an in-house digital team. I'm not really talking about IT here. I don't really care about, Office and Microsoft Office support. I'm talking about people with this sort of hybrid skills of digital and heritage that can make something out of it in support of the mission. And I think this is the major blocker here. There are also almost no stakeholder incentives to be more data-centric or data-driven or data-informed. So if I look at there's another government agency that reports on cultural statistics to the government. Last year again, 2017 was the first time in the report to the government that they included any digital metric whatsoever. So which metric did they choose to include? They included number of page views on Swedish museum websites. If you give me a couple of hours, I might be able to come up with a worse KPI than that, but that's a pretty bad one. It's because it sets all the wrong incentives, I think, and doesn't really say anything about success at all. There's also a very recent report from the state auditors of Sweden that concluded that many Swedish museums don't actually know what they have in their collections. I don't think this is unique to Swedish museums, but part of their report was that museums should prioritize higher the basic work of digitization so that they actually know what objects they have in their collections. And in the next stage, of course, what state they are in, what they represent in terms of historical heritage and so on. I think this report might actually be a first good incentive here from the government. In the aggregate then, Swedish Open Cultural Heritage, this aggregator, like I said, it's more than 60 museums. I think it's 64 at the moment, 7 million entries. And of course, 7 million entries is not something that any user can really make sense of. And some of the others here presented that if you just sort of invite a user to a collection like that and you put up a search box and say, type in whatever, you're really not helping your user find their way. So we suffer from outdated interfaces. And also another thing, so 60 museums, 60 museum collections, but Swedish museums don't really use linked data vocabularies, and in the case when they do use them, they don't use the same. There's actually a big business opportunity here for Getty, maybe. I think it would be a good idea for Swedish museums not to invent their vocabulary of their own, but actually localize international ones into Swedish, because that would also result in international interoperability. But that actually makes this 7 million collection not as valuable or easy to explore as it could be if you don't have semantic interoperability. Luckily, though, we actually do have a small team of hybrid digital heritage specialists. So what we can do, we can actually try to overcome these problems on not only in our own aggregator, but also on behalf of the Swedish museums. So next thing then is, if I'm now claiming that Swedish museums don't know how to take advantage of their data, at least in as good a way as they could, what could success look like? And as many others here have mentioned today, I think one way is that to make it as easy as possible to gain insight and understanding. The bigger the data, the more you need to probably visualize it to make it easier to understand. This is not rocket science, and I'm not an academic, so unlike Theodosia, I can't point out to lots of publications to prove my point, so that's why I just stick to my bullet point number 1. It's just too abstract to grasp for the non-specialist. I think any UX designer would be able to tell you that. One of the things that we have been working with in one of our best practices project is generous interfaces for digital collections. I don't know how many of you know of this term or this design paradigm, but it is an attempt to design user interfaces for collections that isn't centered around that empty search box. It has 4 design principles, and I think those actually, maybe with some adaptation, apply quite well to data visualization as well, which is the ones that I've listed here. Of course, when we talk about visualization, it is partially to make things understandable for the layperson. And this is why I ask you the question, how many institutions made data available for download, because I really think that you should also make it possible for other people to make their analyses and their visualizations. It's sort of a reproducible science principle. And I would like to say there as well is that developers are also users. When you design technical interfaces, APIs or interfaces that allow you to download data, you need to put some user design effort into that as well. Because just as many users would sort of quickly leave a website if they think something looks too difficult, so will developers. One way of making a developer-oriented user interface for data that is fairly new is something called Jupyter Notebook. And basically it does a certain level of automatic visualization. There's a digital humanist in Australia called Tim Sherratt. If you don't follow him on Twitter, please do, because he's always busy doing very interesting and inspiring things. And what he has done is that he has downloaded loads and loads of Australian public data, put them into a Jupyter Notebook and made them available in this way, which makes them a lot more accessible for a developer than what they are on their original source websites. So this is something that a lot of us could take inspiration from. The other thing I wanted to mention is this thing. So if you have a collection of 7 million objects, you just put a search box there, you're not really helping your user. And so as part of this generous interfaces to collections prototyping project that we did, we made an interactive visualization, and I will show the timeline here, to try to experiment with ways that we could overcome that sort of that hurdle. So 7 million objects, about what? And so this is the English interface to it. Some of the metadata is in Swedish, of course, or most of it. But I will explain a bit. So this is not just a static visualization. You will see objects, which actually in this case is our bad Swinglish for artifacts, photographs, documents, buildings, etc. These are the main object types in this aggregator. And you will see them spread out over time. And then you see these tag clouds here below. These are not static. So in Sweden, for example, the Bronze Age in archaeology is defined as 800 BC to 500 BC. And now you see the tag cloud updates here as I select a time slice in this timeline. And you will also see that bronze is actually the most frequent keyword in this period, which tells me that, well, we did something right here. But there are, of course, other periods. So the Iron Age, for example, is in Sweden about 500 BC, 2050. Actually, iron again turns up as the most common keyword. You also see a lot more institutions here now. Basically, the institution you saw for the Bronze Age was the National Archaeological Museum. Not a lot of the other museums have this. But another thing that this type of visualization is very good for is as a quality assurance tool, because you discover metadata issues here. You will note, for example, that we have a little bump here in photographs. And so either we have time-traveling photographers or these are faulty metadata. And when we looked into this a bit deeply, we see different issues here. Sometimes it's because the metadata field for the date on this photograph is actually not the date of the photograph, but what it's a photograph of. And in some cases, we've also discovered some collections who use 0 as a way in their metadata field to indicate that the date is unknown. So there are these types of artifacts. So this is a way of I wouldn't say that this should replace the search box for a big collection, but it is a complement to it. And for smaller collections, there are also some other more interesting things with generous interfaces that you can do. Let's go back to the, to the presentation. I also think that, yes, even if you do visualize, you need also to make the data part of telling a story. You need to appeal to both sides of your audience's brains. Some people are very data-oriented, some are very story-oriented. Many people make sense of the world through story. And of course, in our case, since we're not Hollywood, our stories need to be both good, as in entertaining, and educational, and they should ideally be based on data. We don't want to tell pure fictional stories in our business. So one area where I think our sector could take some inspiration and perhaps also use some existing tools is the field of data journalism, which is long-form journalism published online, but that takes advantage of things like data visualization and also tends to publish its data sources as part of the article that they publish, to be able to reproduce, to check the veracity of a story. There are two, if you want to get started doing data visualization, you don't want to buy anything, you could get started with online services like Data Wrapper. Pageflow is a CMS that is purpose-made to make these kind of data-driven stories. Both are open source ones, which makes me more comfortable providing the links to them. So the final thing then is that stories should, of course, ideally result in some sort of impact in our audiences, in society. I've added a link because I hadn't heard about culture counts as an impact framework. The one I was going to mention is the Europeana Impact Playbook. So it has, I think, the same kinds of goals that culture counts. The basic premise is that saying that our service has a net promoter score of 78 is not the same thing as saying that you've had an impact with your audience. So quantitative and qualitative data should, I think, ultimately serve the mission of museums. And the mission of museums is to make some sort of impact with their audience and society. It depends a bit on which type of museum you are. So really, I want to just reinforce that big data, of course, isn't an end in and of itself. So I started off with a red slide saying what could success look like, and I think this might be a way to phrase what success could look like or read like. It's when data, big or small, gains us greater insight, both museums and their audiences, that we may tell better stories that have measurable impact on our audiences and in society. And actually, I think you could do that for most of the digital technology that is used in museums, because again, digital isn't the purpose of most museums. You have some other type of mission statement that digital should be in service of. From the Swedish perspective then, how do we get there? I do think our funders need to rethink a bit of their incentives, what they ask for, and maybe they themselves should actually put a lot more effort into trying to describe the impact they want to get via their funding, and let museums find their way there in terms of methodology and actual projects. But to make things more sustainable, they should, and Swedish funders now already do require open access, and I think it's just a matter of a few years when they will also require publishing the data openly. I mean, all integrity laws and things permitting, of course, but this should be the principle. And this aligns, of course, also very well with the FAIR principles. And I think they should support more sustainable solutions than they do now. They tend to be very project-focused. The projects tend to dissolve after they've done. Link rot sets in. I think, Joan, you were trying to show something in your presentation, and it just isn't there online anymore. And this is been repeated for the last 10 years over and over again, also on the European Union level. So I think it's more sustainable, and others have argued for that as well, to fund teams and infrastructure, not projects. And not also, in many cases, individual databases. Try to find an infrastructure of complementary data infrastructures, as in they do slightly different things, rather than one big infrastructure to rule them all, or many small infrastructures that try to be everything. That's what I mean with complementary. The museums, if they do want to take advantage of digital, they need to recruit a bit differently. And I think they need to stop just asking for more money and actually do some internal prioritization and set aside maybe 5%, 4%, whatever. If they really want to tackle the digital age, they do need to do a little bit of investment of their own. So if a museum has 100 employees, maybe 4 or 5 of them should actually be digital, hybrid, and heritage specialists. Otherwise, you can't accomplish much of your own, and you might also be easily led astray by commercial external providers, because you won't have the digital skills even to set up good requirements and deals with them. But in a country like Sweden, which is small in terms of population at least, many museums shouldn't have an in-house digital team. But it does mean that Swedish publicly funded museums need to network and share, also in a way, staff resources. They need to adopt some of these other principles I've talked about, sharing much more horizontally between themselves the outcomes, the processes, the data, the source code that they have created, so that other museums can benefit from it. And also build external partnerships, certainly with academia. And this is something that the funders are actually trying to incentivize right now. And another possible game changer, well, actually, they are already, I would say, in Sweden, is the GLAM Wiki partnerships, the partnerships between libraries, archives, and museums, and the wiki community. Certainly in terms of reaching a large audience, they are a fantastic force multiplier. And for us at the National Heritage Board, certainly our current strategy is to try to sort of, we don't call ourselves a digital lab, and maybe we should. Maybe people would understand it better. But that's basically what my team tries to be. A digital lab, not in service of the National Heritage Board, but one that is in service of the museums of the country. So those who don't have one themselves can actually partner with us, and we will do something together. And in this, ultimately, we should aim for redundancy. Success further in the future should mean, I think, that the National Heritage Board doesn't need to have this kind of central team. On the other hand, technology will always progress. Maybe someone slightly bigger than most other museums should always be there and take the lead. And then we need to live up to the same principles I've said here that others should live up to. Open access, open data, open source, open algorithms, and so on. we're also actually a funder ourselves, so we should live up to the same ideals there. So that's how I think we can get there. Top 3 takeaways. I've cheated a bit here, so if you're good at maths, you'll find that it's actually 5. Size doesn't matter. I'm still not entirely sure what big data is, or what small data would be in that case. Insight, story, and impact, I think is really important. That is not an end in and of itself. And together, at least in Sweden, we need to work together in order to digitally transform the Swedish museum sector. There's not one single institution big enough to do it all on their own.